Jesus had just begun his ministry way up there in Galilee, which was in the middle of nowhere. He had only just begun, but the word spread and the crowds came. He had said, "Follow me," and follow they did. The crowds came limping and climbing, begging and demanding from the cities and from the towns, the Jews and the Gentiles, from the mountains and the coast, overlarge, overburdened, overwrought, and they said, "Help." Jesus had just begun his ministry when he asked them to follow. And the crowds came with their demons and their debts, their hunger and their anger, and they were too many for just one man, even just one man who was Jesus, to save alone. So he took off. With Peter and with James and with John, he took off far, far from the crowds, far from the cries and from the calls. They took off. Who wouldn't? They climbed a mountain, one of the highest they could find, and they were alone. They were apart from the world. Finally. And suddenly, or as the story says, Jesus was transfigured, transformed, elevated, changed. In a scene of dazzling light and booming voices, of rolling clouds and of terror, he was transfigured before them. He shines. His face, his hands, his garments dazzled brightly, reflecting what the ancient scholars call the light of the highest of holies, the light of God. Peter, basking in his light, blurts out his desire to set up 3 dwellings, 3 temples, 3 houses there to capture the experience. Peter wants to remain there. He wants to remain high and apart, alone from the crowds and from the cries. He pleads to remain on the mountaintop, far from the ills and the sufferings that are plaguing the world. It is good for us to be here. You see, Peter had heard that call to follow. He left behind his fishing net and was following Jesus as best he could. Through the healing and the preaching, the crying crowds and the dying children. For Peter, following Jesus wasn't that simple. It was exhausting. It was uncomfortable. It was terrifying. So Peter longs to dwell just a bit longer in that glory, in that peace of this moment. Because at the foot of the mountain waited the crowds, limping and climbing and begging and demanding. But poor Peter, the glory evaporates as fast as it had gathered, and Jesus doesn't linger. He gathers up his disciples, he brushes them off, and they trudge back down the mountain, back to the crowds. For centuries, church scholars and leaders have tried to make the case that this moment, this transfiguration, is part of the major milestones of the life of Jesus. They say it belongs right up there with his birth and his crucifixion and his resurrection. But the church isn't filled. We don't have special Christmas or special cards, holiday cards for the transfiguration. We don't throw a party. They claim that this is the moment when the human nature of the world meets God. They claim that this is the moment, with flashes of bright light and glimpses of glory, that heaven and earth grow just a bit closer. With Jesus as the bridge or the connection, heaven and earth kiss. Jesus shines. In that moment, Jesus shines with the light of God, scholars say. The light of God being that sure and steadfast reminder of God's loving presence among God's people. Care of the needy, helper of the helpless, lover of the unloved, the one who feeds, who provides, strengthens, and loves. And that's when I stumble. with the ancient scholars, with the understanding that this is when heaven and earth really kiss. You see, I think Jesus' ministry, his work, his life, has already been reflecting that light from above, God's love. In his preaching of the good news, in his healing of the sick, in his feeding of the hungry, the lifting of the poor, the accepting of the rejected. In his new ministry, Jesus was already sharing and radiating and reflecting that light from above, that love that shines so bright. So maybe it isn't Jesus who is transfigured or transformed. Perhaps it was the disciples, Peter, James, and John, who were being transformed and changed and converted, transfigured. They were shown that bright and unfading light that they may descend from the mountain and spread that light, become that light. You see, that brightness that glows, that light reflecting off of Jesus, it reflects off of his words, his actions. It is a light that calls and pushes, sustains, and shines. A light that shines as he ushers the disciples back down the mountain to that hungry, poor, broken crowd. It is that same light that 94 years ago called this church and other churches around the United States like it to partner with Unitarians in Transylvania. They had gone to Transylvania on a pilgrimage to see the birthplace of Unitarianism. And they saw the devastation caused by war and poverty. They felt the discrimination that Unitarians felt. They came down the mountain, standing with them, providing hope, support, light. It is that same light that has called this church time and time again to work for the cause of the unhoused, to build homes around the world so families could have protection and dignity, standing with them, providing hope, support, light. It is that same light that inspired us to partner with Common Cathedral to assemble and provide backpacks so our homeless neighbors could face winter with a few necessary supplies, standing with them, providing hope, support, light. It is a spark, a light, calling, prodding, pushing us to go down the mountain and into the crowds even still. Perhaps that's why this story, this transfiguration, should be part of the major milestones of the life of Jesus. It's not the descending clouds or the glimpse of glory, but that they saw light by his actions and by his words, and they went down the mountain. Jesus didn't let Peter build dwellings or a temple in the high and safe place, but brushed him off. Led him back down the mountain to a hungry crowd, a crowd plagued with illness and heartache, poverty and grief. To stand with them, hope with them, light. In the Transfiguration, Jesus invites us to come out of ourselves, to forsake our human certainties, and to make ourselves a gift of unbounded love, to make ourselves light. Jesus calls on us to be the light of the world, to radiate the mercy of God into the dark crevices of our broken world, to love. In our willingness to be vulnerable, to love, to go back down the mountain, to be that light creating, dark abating blessing, we reflect the purposes of God and the purpose of the gospel. This Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. With it, we will enter the season of Lent. It is the season in the life of the church in which we journey with Jesus. And those of us who have heard this story before know where back down the mountain eventually leads. Through a valley, to Jerusalem flanked with palms and praise, to a cross, to a heavy tomb, and then to that great mystery that defies our limitations. And in that journey, in that valley, we experience a glimmer of light, the light of God, reflected on the face of our brother Jesus, the light that burned above the nativity, that radiated atop the mountain, that light that guides our path as we take up our cross and follow him. The path we walk is dark. When we go down the mountain, we will need that light, and perhaps even be that light. Thanks be to God. Amen.